The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, a senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, the expansion of the internet in Africa has been one of the most exciting stories of the past 10 years. I mean, just a decade ago, it would have been hard for people to imagine that where we are today in terms of how many people are getting online and are online. But accompanying this positive story is also a growing sense of concern about the spread of surveillance technologies and also some of the more anti-democratic uses of some of the technologies. And all of that is tied intimately to China. Now, on the one hand, Chinese technology companies have done an amazing job at bringing low-cost and affordable smartphones, also networking telecommunications equipment, and really making the expansion of all of this ICT, internet information communications technologies possible. But as we know, what comes with good also comes with bad, and really that story is so intimately tied with Huawei. Tell us what the connection is with Huawei, Cobus.
Well, the short answer is that Huawei is one of the main providers of internet as a whole in Africa. And that includes everything from the components used to build networks, the undersea cables, the networks themselves, up to things like cell phone handsets. Huawei is a massive provider of all of these different things. So they work with a lot of African cell phone providers in providing support and components for their networks. And then they're also seller of phones themselves. A very, very big player in the African market. As the case with Meng Wanzhou and the general kind of tension around Huawei escalates in the US and elsewhere, Africa is put into this difficult position where, as the security issues around Huawei networks are raised, the reality is that the majority of African networks were produced either by Huawei or ZTE or both. And so, Africa itself becomes this very interesting kind of playing ground around all of these issues around Chinese tech and then related anxieties around surveillance and data.
Now, Huawei, just to give a little bit of background, Huawei was indicted by the United States under 23 different counts in both New York and Washington. And this is really part of a broader struggle that the United States is having with Huawei. Cobus, you mentioned Meng Wanzhou, who is the chief financial officer who was arrested in Canada and is now being extradited or in the process of being extradited to the United States. And it's all part of the fact that the United States believes, or at least alleges, that Huawei violated sanctions on Iranian trade. And it also is this part of this broader concern that Huawei equipment is potentially, again, there's been no verification or facts or evidence, and we have to really emphasize this yet, that Huawei equipment is being compromised by the Chinese Communist Party or by the Chinese security state. However, the United States definitely thinks and suspects that there is the likelihood that that is happening. So that's one of the reasons why that the United States is going after Huawei so hard and so fast around different parts of the world. So going back to your point, Cobus, about how the United States is also trying to rally countries in places like Africa, in Europe, to abandon Huawei equipment, but it's finding a tough go at it. And a lot of different countries are saying, you know what, we're in too deep with Huawei. We're not, what your problems are not our problems. So we thought it would be great to get a discussion on surveillance, Huawei, equipment, technology, censorship, all of that. And we're thrilled to have Emeka Umeje, who is a visiting assistant professor in the School of Arts and Sciences at American University of Nigeria in Yola. He's also a former newspaper journalist and holds a PhD in journalism and media studies from Wits in Johannesburg. Emeka, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, nice to be here. I'm happy to join this conversation. It's an important one that we should have because whether we like it or not, Africa is going to be a pawn, on the chessboard, between the U.S. and China from the way things are unfolding. Yeah, yeah. So I'm good. I'm
So
happy to be
let's
here.
Yeah, it's a very important discussion. We've talked about Huawei. Let's get right into it. What is your take on Huawei, Africa, and the United States?
Okay, what I think is that it's the relationship between even if you look at Chinese media organizations and Chinese ICT organizations, it's mostly two-faceted. You have the good part and the negative part of it. We must acknowledge that Chinese infrastructures has helped the growth of ICT in Africa. That is what everybody has to acknowledge. That no two ways about that. But then again, you ask yourself, what do we want in Africa? Africa wants democracy. We need freedom of expression. We need political pluralism to be able to develop on the African continent. And nobody has ever wondered what would happen with a hegemonic Chinese internet. Because if you follow closely, you will recall that Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, predicted that the world will have two internets, with the US-led internet and the Chinese-led internet, But the problem is that why the countries in the global north have the capacity to mitigate a Chinese-led internet, African countries do not have that. So this is where the challenge comes for African countries,
How have you seen African commentators reacting to Huawei, to this Huawei case, and these kind of issues on a wider level? In South Africa, I was following the South African tech press on and their comments on this, and they were quite cynical about it, and they were saying. They were essentially characterizing the entire court case as an acknowledgement by the U.S. that U.S. companies are not actually are not cutting up with Huawei, and that Huawei produces all of these quite sturdy and dependable equipment for very cheaply, and that this is essentially a kind of a covert way of trying to claw back market share. Did you see a kind of similar kind of cynical approach to this in like Nigeria and elsewhere, or are people actually legitimately concerned about these security issues?
Yeah, what people believe, there's always people think, it's a matter of competition on the one hand, but most educated because most people don't even know anything about this. People just want to, make phone calls, have access to the internet. They don't understand. People don't even want to know about the other side of it, the negative aspect of it, But when you speak to people who are informed about some of these issues, as well people who are educated, they are concerned because the fear is that China is not a democracy, and you cannot give what you don't have, So if in the long run we have, a Chinese-led internet, become hegemonic in Africa, it's going to be it's going to affect democracy on the continent, definitely, because you cannot give what you have. That means in that instance, if issues of, for instance, an election was conducted and it wasn't transparent and people protested, they will not have access, they will not have space, to outlet for such expressions if we have a hegemonic Chinese internet in Africa. So this is the challenge here. It's a peculiar problem. Because like I pointed out from the outset, I said that the problem with Africa is that we do not have the capacity to mitigate a Chinese-led internet, unlike what you have in the global north, So this remains a challenge. I don't think that even any African country would, stand up and say, we're going to cancel a contract, Chinese Huawei contract, like that. Because there's no money. People are here, people are barely struggling. The government needs help. Most of the governments in Africa are going cap in hand to China to beg for, financial aid and assistance. So China has that edge here. So we come back to the issue of power relations. The power relation between China and Africa is very, very lopsided. China is there up and Africa is down. So we don't have that power. We don't have the capacity to mitigate the future of a hegemonic Chinese internet in Africa would bring to Africa. This is what I think. But like you rightly pointed out, people would think, it's a matter of competition. But nobody's looking at the future. Nobody's looking at in the long run, And this is why we are researchers, we are academics, because we look at the future. We don't look at now. For now, it's good. For now, African countries will have access to the internet. They have cheap digital infrastructures everywhere, cheap ICT infrastructures on the continent. But we are not concerned about now. We're talking about 10, 20 years from now. What happens? What happens to democracy on the continent? And I don't know if you're taking cognizance of internet shutdowns on the continent. It has been on the rise, and just give it another 10 years and see what will happen. So this is my own fear, and this is what many people have interviewed in the course of this field work. I've also experienced saying, yes, we agree that China is providing a cheap sort of digital infrastructure, but we are scared of what the future will bring, because we know that China is not a democracy. China is an autocracy. So this is just this is the issue in this whole thing. Yeah.
So let's take a look at the future a little bit in your crystal ball that you academics use to kind of forecast the future. In the United States, the concern about Huawei is that it will be secretly used by the Chinese to surveil and to spy on Americans or on American allies. In Africa, I think the concern's a little bit different. It won't be anything covert, it'll be overt. That is that the Chinese have developed very sophisticated methods to use telecommunications to surveil, and so that African governments, like in Ethiopia, in Zambia, and elsewhere, could call on the Chinese through Huawei to use it to overtly, openly, to teach them how to spy on their own people, on dissidents, and to restrict civil rights. So talk to me a little bit about the future of Chinese technology and how it could potentially reshape the African internet because of what you said is the big man problem in Africa. And those big men are autocrats like, former Congolese President Joseph Kabila and others who don't care about the civil rights of their people, but they want to make sure that they use technology to stay in power and to further their grip on power.
So, even this is happening almost everywhere in Africa, even in Nigeria. Why we agree that we're in a democracy and we have freedom of information here in Nigeria, but it's not free. We have seen instances where journalists have been, detained without any court orders, and so many, rights flouted. And if this could happen in Nigeria, it could happen anywhere. So this fear, the fear is real. It cannot be dismissed with a wave of the hand that, the future is precarious, so to speak. If a Chinese, a hegemonic Chinese internet is established in Africa, I don't think that democracy will just die, because I don't know if you follow the latest release by the Freedom House, I think which was a few days ago. You will see that democracy is dying, especially in developing countries. Democracy is beginning to lose ground, and this raises the red flag on the penetration of Chinese ICTs on the continent. We have more internet shutdowns. In recent times in Nigeria, the government has. I'm just saying the government has not said they're going to shut the internet down during the elections next week, but a few persons had played with that. That saying, the internet can be shut down so that but we don't know anything can happen. Countries like we've seen it in Zambia, we've seen it in Uganda. Those are normal. It has become a normative, of the political culture in those climes. So what we're saying is, because of the big man syndrome in Africa, this will definitely happen. We don't want to say, it would happen. It's going to happen. We know we are Africa. We know this happens. We know our leaders don't care about civil rights, about freedom of expression. And so, if in the long run we have hegemonic Chinese standards in Africa, it is going to have adverse consequences for democracies on the continent. This is my own submission. And from what
so I definitely see your point, but I wonder if you'd allow me to just play devil's advocate for a moment. In the first place, you essentially making 2 points that seem to me a little bit in contradiction to each other, in the sense that you express a lot of concern about the decline of democracy in Africa, but then at the same time you're saying that the system as we've had it up to now, which does contain some democracy, tends to lead to these kind of big man, situations. So democracy itself tends to produce, these kind of non-ideal kind of governance systems in many African countries. So I think a Chinese perspective on that, just in the here, I'm just, kind of amalgamating, some people that I've interviewed and so on over the years, would be that democracy can't lead to development, that development has to lead to democracy. And that widespread, massive rollout of the internet is crucial to development in the 21st century. And you have to get it done as cheaply as possible and as competently as possible through companies that are used to working in difficult circumstances. And the only companies who really do that work at large scale at the moment are Chinese companies. So that, so they would essentially make the point that you need to get this development up and running. And then that will allow, kind of a larger number of citizens to live their lives and to actually be able to make a better life for their children. But then that might actually even be a solution for the big man problem too. What would you say to that kind of way of looking at it?
Well, I agree that with the spread of the internet, that will help development in Africa. I've acknowledged that from the outset, But what I'm saying is that after this has happened, and for now we have this happening because the Chinese internet is not hegemonic yet in Africa. It's still taking shape. But we also know that Huawei and ZTE are the major suppliers of digital ICT infrastructures on the continent, But what I'm saying is that in 10 years' time, now we have, hegemonic. We have a new global order. Now we have a global order that has two dominant players, China and the US. But let's assume maybe in 10, 20 years' time, we have a global order that is dominated by China, for instance, And now we have a hegemonic Chinese internet that is established, both in Africa and in other parts of the world. It will not be the same thing. Then why we have had our own development, but we don't have the freedom to speak out against certain instances, especially when those issues affect human rights and and political pluralism, because China doesn't have any of these things. And I don't think that China can give what it does not have, China cannot come and encourage democracy in your country because China is not a democracy. You understand? So I agree quite right that this is good for development on the African continent. Very, very good for development. But we should, that's why I've always said in my argument about China-Africa relations, that it's incumbent on African leaders to ensure that why they deepen relationship with China, to ensure that in the long run, it is beneficial, to the African people. So, but unfortunately, I don't think that we have those kind of leaders who have that mindset of thinking, how it affects my people, how does it affect democracy? How does it affect freedom of expression? Because these guys live in a mentality that is called the African big man mentality. Their mentality rhymes with, autocracy, So this is where the problem comes in. So our question should be, how do we mitigate, the adverse effect of a hegemonic Chinese internet when it happens? Because whether it will happen. So, but how do we mitigate it? For now, in the global north, what you see, why I agree that it's a matter of, some form of competition, but it's also part of mitigation, The US people are trying to mitigate, what would happen. It's happening in Europe, it's happening, in Australia, we've seen it everywhere. But the African people are not taking in that regard, And there's no hope that our leaders will take in that regard, because the leaders here are still going cap in hand, begging for, money to survive. So it means that in 10, 20 years' time, we will have a new global order, or we will have two dominant versions of the internet, the Chinese and the US internet and the US-led internet. And Africa will just be a pawn, on the chessboard. So that means you could push them anywhere. You could do anything you want with the African people, So this is going to be a problem. I think, from my interactions with people, this is also a problem. People are wondering, people say, that's the educated people are saying, in the long run, this is going to happen. But the people who are the poor people don't really care about all these things. We must agree to that. That poor men, poor people don't, the plebeians, they don't think anything about it, they don't care about that, So this is what we have to be concerned about. We have to be concerned about how would African leaders, or how would Africa itself, mitigate, a hegemonic Chinese internet, in 10 to 20 years' time. I think that's the right question we should be looking at, yeah.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at @VitsChinaAfrica or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
So it's not just a question of Huawei and the hardware, which is what Huawei sells, in terms of shaping the African internet, but let's also talk about artificial intelligence, because that's going to play an increasingly important role. There's a book that I've been talking about quite a bit on the show over the past few months, AI Superpowers by Kai-Fu Lee, who is the former head of Google China, the former head of Microsoft, and also a venture capitalist in China. And his theory is that in the next 10 years or so, that regions and countries are going to have to make a choice. Are they going to be on the Chinese side of the artificial intelligence equation, or are they going to be on the American side? Because one side is going to be dominated by Google, Facebook, Twitter, and those companies, and Amazon, and another side will be dominated by ByteDance, Alibaba, Tencent, and the others. And there will be no middle ground, is what he says. You will either have to commit to the Chinese side or to the American side. Cobus, let me get your take first, and then we'll go to Emeka.
I mean, what I find a little perplexing about this argument, and I've heard it many times, is that I think Africa kind of provides a little bit of a counter narrative to that, because at the moment what we see in Africa is very widespread kind of rollout of Chinese shaped networks, Chinese kind of built according to Chinese specifications, with Chinese equipment by Chinese companies, unfunded by the Chinese government. That those networks have rolled out very quickly. What we haven't seen is a simultaneous kind of rollout and promotion of, but even kind of popular uptake of Chinese net services and internet services. We have there is some attempt to launch Alibaba here. There's some attempt to launch things like WeChat and Alipay and these kind of payment services, but a lot of them tend to be very much siloed in for the use of Chinese tourists. We have not seen a massive rollout or take up of uptake. I mean, of Chinese actual, kind of any kind of Chinese web, kind of massive kind of web presence in Africa. What we've seen is the uptake of things like Twitter and Facebook and WhatsApp particularly, on Chinese networks, on Chinese built networks. So I don't know if this kind of like double internet kind of logic really holds water for me, because I think Africa actually provides a kind of a counter example.
But I think you have, in terms of smartphones, you have more of Chinese phones now, Chinese phone makers in Africa. I mean, I think they did. I'm not very clear about it, but I think they are leaders of the market. You have Techno, you have Xiaomi, you have Huawei. For smartphone makers in Africa, these guys are pushing the market. In terms of WeChat is also gaining some traction here and there. So it's just a matter of time. It's a matter of time.
See, I don't know if I agree. Like because again, kind of people are using Chinese phones to access American apps. A lot of people I know in South Africa have Chinese-made phones. Like kind of Huawei is a big phone provider here, but I don't know one single person who's actually, except for people in the Chinese community in South Africa, who is actually on WeChat. Like they all run things like Twitter and Facebook and WhatsApp off their Chinese phones.
No, I think I don't know I know a few persons who are on WeChat. Yeah. I do know.
Okay. So maybe South Africa is an exception.
They're not much. We agree they're not much for now, but they're there.
Not much for now, but Cobus, remember how quickly certain technologies can be adopted. So YouTube and Facebook and a lot of them went from 0 to 100 million, 200 million very, very fast. So it's not to say that today we may not see it, but companies like ByteDance and their algorithms for news can easily and very quickly be adapted. And I know for a fact in South Africa, there's great concern among certain media companies about the rise of ByteDance in China, which is the news aggregation services and the algorithms that are being used to frame news and to deliver news. A lot of those are Chinese algorithms that are being used. So the adoption we don't see it today, but if a service comes out, and so, for example, on Techno phones, they're introducing a new music service that will be embedded into the phone. So we may not see it as a front-facing branded service like Facebook or Twitter, but it might be the algorithms behind the scenes that people don't even know that they're being used, and those can have very, very rapid adoption. That's just is one thought. Very quickly, Emeka, before we close our show, you wrote an article back in December called "Will China's Investments Reshape Africa's Internet?" And you wrote that in power3.0.org. We'll put a link to that article in the show notes for everybody to see. But tell us very quickly, in terms of wrapping up our discussion, about the role that China will have in reshaping Africa's internet in the coming years.
I think it has to do more with investment in digital infrastructure, ICT infrastructures on the continent. That is gaining traction overnight because people, like rightly highlighted earlier on, people are talking about, it's cheap, and I mean, African governments don't seem to have the money to buy, very, very good one, so to speak, maybe the American one. So they prefer to buy the Chinese one. So why we do this, why this continues? In the long run, what we have, majority of ICT infrastructures in Africa, being Chinese-backed infrastructures. And like you rightly said, Huawei is building. Huawei Marine is building the peace network connecting East Africa and South Asia. So they're connecting everywhere. They're building an optical fiber network, connecting, linking Africa and the rest of the world. So in the long run, what you have two networks in Africa. You have one, the US-led network, and the other one led by China. And we must tell ourselves the truth. The one being built by China is growing by the day. It's cheaper, it's affordable for the African government to purchase. But like I said again, its effect, in the long run, is not going to be very, very palatable. But most African leaders don't think there's anything wrong, in buying Chinese ICT infrastructures or digital infrastructure. They say, if some people also think that what if China has developed, because what African countries see most time is they see China as a model. China has developed. People are going to tell you, but China has lifted more than 500 million people from poverty to the to middle class. But can't we do it? We can do it if they develop with ensuring that there's no freedom of expression. I mean, if we do it in Africa, it's not bad. The most important thing is that our people are better off, But our leaders don't see this picture. So I keep on saying this, that the African big man mentality, the African big man syndrome, seem to, correlate with, the Chinese, what China has on offer, which is the Chinese autocracy. And that makes it more attractive for our African leaders, that's going to also empower them to control the internet. These days, look at what is happening in southern Cameroon, for instance. These guys have been without internet for how long for now? And nobody seems to care. And it continues like that. More African countries are beginning to think of shutting down the internet as a form of repression, as a form of countering the opposition. So we'll see more of this happen on the continent. So our own, like I pointed out rightly, I said, how do we mitigate this in the long run? Yeah. So this is just my own concern. And this is the concern of most people who are, most people that have spoken to, especially policymakers, they feel like, how do we mitigate this? Why we all agree that it's a good thing for us to have these infrastructures, but in the long run, 10, 20 years from now, it's going to count, and it might not be so palatable for African countries. Thank you.
Emeka Umeje is a visiting assistant professor in the School of Arts and Sciences at American University of Nigeria in Yola. He's really one of the sharpest minds thinking about African ICT issues going forward, particularly with the relationship with China. The article, Will China's Investments Reshape Africa's Internet, is on Power 3.0, which is power, the spelled out 0.org. It's a little bit tricky, but again, we'll have links for it. Emeka, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And are you on social media or so that people can follow you and get in touch if they want to keep on top of what you're reading and writing?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter as Emeka Umeje, at Emeka Umeje on Twitter, yeah.
Wonderful. We'll put a link to Emeka's Twitter handle as well in the show notes as well. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
I'm grateful.
Cobus, it's hard to kind of get your head around whether or not the Chinese internet in Africa is a net positive, which I think, again, I've said many times that I think the Chinese deserve the Nobel Prize for what they've done to wire up Africa and to bring telecommunications to people and to regions that would never have it without the low-cost services that were provided backed by Chinese loans, and also equipment that is much cheaper through companies like Huawei. But at the same time, there is this concern that Chinese methods, not even just the technology, but methods of surveillance and suppression are also being introduced into the continent. I want to bring attention to something you wrote in China File. And China File is a website by the Asia Society that talks about all issues related to China. And you recently wrote, as part of a conversation with lots of thinkers about Huawei and the Chinese internet in Africa, you wrote, quote, "Young Africans are hungry for connectivity, and Huawei is willing to connect them. Security is important, but Africa is still struggling to get itself fully online. This takes a lot of funding and lots of cheap, sturdy components. In Africa, the real issue is who except Chinese companies like Huawei can do this work." And I thought that was interesting because maybe the debate over Huawei in places like Africa is absolutely academic because they don't have any other choice but to go with Huawei.
That's kind of the feeling that I get, because I think a lot of kind of US companies aren't necessarily particularly interested in doing this massive expansion in Africa. And frequently when they talk about it, it comes a lot more in the, not really as a kind of a business transaction, much more couched as a form of philanthropy. Like, for example, I don't know if that scheme or that project is still running, but the idea that Google had a while ago to have these kind of massive like big balloons, kind of that essentially like beam internet to different parts of Africa. So, I don't know that anyone else is particularly kind of interested in doing that work. So, and for me, for all of, and I share Emeka's concerns about the way that these tools can be used by governments. I mean, we've seen it happen already in Africa. But at the same time, I wonder what will be more repressive. The internet, and a fully working internet that is occasionally kind of misused by governments, or no internet at all. So it seems to me that everywhere that the internet goes in Africa, as these data networks are rolled out, you see this kind of flourishing of expression, of kind of African expression. Some of it being, like ethnocentric or xenophobic or problematic in other ways, but a lot of it is the first time people get to express themselves online, and that I think has value.
Yeah, it does have value, and I think it's going to be a very hard sell for the Americans to persuade African governments to abandon Huawei, in part because of the benefits that it brings. This undersea marine cable, the peace cable that Emeka talked about, that's coming from Asia all the way to Africa, is going to bring vast amounts of new bandwidth and connectivity to the continent. Now, that is something that people desperately want and desperately need. So the idea that to say, no, back away on suspicions, not even, again, verifiable truths, that Huawei is sending information back to the Chinese Communist Party or to the Chinese security state or to the Chinese government is, again, I think, a very tall order for people to buy in Africa. And I don't think I think they're going to say what you basically said. This just isn't our fight. You guys may have a problem with Huawei, but we see the benefits outweighing the costs in that sense. Final thoughts from you.
Well, what I wonder then is what will happen if if a situation kind of comes in where the US government becomes a lot more punitive towards other governments who work with Huawei. The fact that Huawei has been, is that part of the accusations that is part of the Huawei case involves sanction busting with Iran. That raises the issue of government to government kind of tensions in relation to the US taking whatever kind of particular kind of attitude towards governments that work in large scale with Huawei. That I think raises a bunch of kind of geopolitical questions. I tend to be a little bit hesitant about the idea of the two internets, simply because I keep wondering, so what, for example, about Russia? Does Russia is Russian internet like aligned with one of the two, or does Russia, is it actually a three internet situation? And then what about India, et cetera, et cetera? But, whatever that situation is, if we're talking about a balkanized internet, then what is the implication of things like sanctions regimes and the kind of punitive mechanisms that come with them being kind of dragged into that particular issue? And where does that leave Africa, not only in relation to China, but in relation to the US?
So what do you think about Huawei, China, Africa, internet, all of it together? Let us know what you think. Send us an email. Give us your thoughts. Send us a post up on our Facebook and LinkedIn and the various social media channels that we have. We always love to hear from you. This is a topic, again, that we're kind of exploring in greater depth, in part because of the importance that it has in the geopolitics and also in the social cultural realm as well, because given the internet has an ability to shape cultures. And so we're going to continue to explore this in the weeks and months ahead. Because and we're geeks and we kind of like it. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at eOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.